Go ahead and get started. And as I said before, all of this is being recorded. It will get captioned and hopefully up by the end of the month. And so these answers will live on for some period of time and be on YouTube and also on videocast along with the presentations. For anyone who just joined, the format's fairly free form. If you are an attendee, feel free to type questions into the chat at any time, and I will do my best to get to all of those. And then I'll also be answering questions or asking questions off of the message board. If I could answer them, this would be way less exciting. So let me go ahead and kick off with one of the more general questions. And I love this question in part because I don't know the answer, which is whenever there's a field that's sort of like more niche, where we have sort of a set number of speakers, there's always this question of where are we in terms of the curve? So, there's like the first publication in Naturalistic Stimuli and individual differences, and then usually there's kind of like a build up to a like first large hill or peak, and then maybe a decrease, and then another peak, and so on and so forth. Where do you all think we are? Do you think that we are early in the process? Like we haven't reached that first peak, there are so many more questions? Do you think that we have sort of a certain mass, a critical mass of papers and ideas moving forward, and everyone's sort of like jumping on the same bandwagon, or people are kind of running to their own roller coasters to define things? Yeah. Where do you think we are? Beginning, middle, hopefully not the end. If anyone says the end, I'll ask you to share your work. Don't all answer at once.
I can answer. I have an answer. I'm not sure whether people will agree or not. I think we're only in the beginning. I think basically naturalistic stimuli are going to wipe out. I also have a very radical position that developed in the last years. So I think it's going to change the paradigm and replace many of the control experiments we're currently doing in the lab. So I know it's a very radical position. I'm not sure whether most of the people on the panel will agree. I can back up why, but I don't want to take more time. But the more I see it, the more I see that it's changing the game, and the game only started to change. And it's not only stimuli, it's also paradigm shifting in the way we're thinking about behavior. And so it's more than simply like, yeah, it's more.
Anyone want
to I think I'd agree that we're near the beginning. I mean, we're definitely past the very initial stage where it was, just a handful of weird people like Uri and stuff that were pushing this. But and so I think it's become much more common than it was. But yeah, I think we've gotten to the stage where we realize there's incredible value in these kinds of approaches. But we've, I think, started also to realize there's so many questions in this space and so many questions about how to design these kinds of experiments and analyze them and share them. And so, yeah, I think we're really just at the beginning of trying to answer all those questions and figure out ways that we can ask a lot of the same questions that we have been using these controlled paradigms for. And, the people on this call are some of the people that are figuring out those answers, but I think we're at the beginning of that.
I'll just jump in. I feel like we should have more controversy here, but I agree that I feel like we're very much at the beginning. I really enjoyed Uri's talk when you kind of made that point that like you're, in the beginning is really about validating and kind of doing little tweaks like, okay, we know this. Is it true when you bring in some ecological validity? And I think a lot of the work is still really kind of straddling that, like making those small changes versus like, okay, that's maybe the wrong questions and we really need to do this kind of big shift or they're different questions. And so it's hard to just kind of be taking that incremental approach. And I would say I still am like have my feet on either side. So I feel like I'm still straddling that. But yeah, I feel that we're very much at the beginning.
I suppose I would agree, but maybe just to be controversial, I'll be a bit of a devil's advocate and just ask, if there's a feeling that naturalistic stimuli would overtake more controlled and constrained paradigms, it seems like maybe there's an inherent challenge with, rather than looking at individual differences, looking at stimulus level effects, because there's so many things that are uncontrolled that might vary between different stimuli, especially if you have small sets of stimuli into conditions. So I guess I was curious about others' thoughts on the promise of naturalistic stimuli as an approach when looking not at individual differences necessarily, but looking at condition contrast or stimulus level effects, and if there's still the same level of optimism with respect to those.
So I mean, I'm the outsider here because I don't do naturalistic, I do resting state. So I was gonna do the perspective of resting state and maybe whether that gets as the conversation goes. So I think for resting state, we might be either on the going down from a second wave or maybe starting the third one. I think the first one was, static connectivity, comparisons across groups, and we passed all that. Then dynamic connectivity came and studies exploded. And I think we're coming down of that because we really need to understand what's really driving that. And hopefully that will bring us to the next level, which is when we really realize that there is no free lunch for resting state. You really need to have information about everything that's going on, not just saying, oh, this is easy to do. We might move forward. So I imagine when I look at the work of what some of you do, which I'm not very familiar, I think I agree that you maybe are on that way, but maybe coming down to realizing that there is to have a better understanding. And also I was going to bring the question, what if you want to do naturalistic on a subject? Not always in comparing it to other subjects, but just like look at one data set on its own. What can you do with it?
You can do a lot. First, I think Emily should speak because she's like also the expert in individual differences.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously pretty keen on naturalistic stimuli, although I have found myself lately, I think there, and I think a lot of us are already thinking about this, but I definitely think there is room for, and this is even a desirable thing, to have stimuli that feel naturalistic but do have certain sort of manipulations baked in a little bit, or just sort of, something that can kind of give us a foothold rather than, borrowing from media has been extremely powerful, but fundamentally, those stimuli were constructed for a specific purpose, and we can borrow from them and we can use them in a lot of interesting ways. But in our work in the lab, we're sort of at times, finding ourselves wanting a little more control. So I think in some ways, to be the devil's advocate a little bit more, maybe we are sort of coming down from a first wave, not down, but sort of like maybe a lateral move towards using some of these like found stimuli, like Hollywood movies and things like that, but then also combining them with stimuli that retain a naturalistic feel, but have certain properties that we've embedded in them as experimenters that give us sort of a foothold or something to model or some way to test certain hypotheses. And I think too, one of the tensions that I see, and I think others do as well, with using naturalistic stimuli for individual differences, there's a lot of talk in the literature these days, especially in sort of the large-scale data sets, functional connectivity, brain behavior, relationships, and prediction, about just the need for more and more data per person, right? And what is the reliability of the signals that we're extracting with fMRI? I think there's some encouraging evidence that we can extract very reliable signals from movie watching data, for example, but I think there's a lot of open questions about, what does it mean to do a sort of test-retest study with a movie? We all know that the experience of watching a film is going to change from the first to second viewing. What kind of reliabilities can we expect? Are these paradigms appropriate for longitudinal designs, for example, or sort of pre-post manipulation? Like, what are the sort of things that we should be thinking about when we're using movies, for example, or other found stimuli in those types of paradigms? And I think it's something that people are thinking about and working on, but that to me is one of the biggest open questions, specifically for studying like within and between subject differences.
I think that's just to jump in at kind of what I was why we're at the beginning is that it's like it's not going to be just a simple like using these stimuli to ask the same questions in the same way. Not that those aren't still good questions or don't have a place in understanding in cognitive neuroscience, but it's more just shifting kind of the way that we're using these naturalistic stimuli and the kinds of questions that we can ask. For a lot of the reasons that you just laid out.
Yeah. So when I started in 2004, I used movies as natural stimuli. But other natural stimuli, they designed by filmmakers. They have like tools like editing and jump cut and dialogues that are written and optimized. So they are natural in the sense that they are part of our life. We see movies, and they are natural in the sense that they show things that are happening to people in real life. You will never meet a Gabor patch in real life, right? Only in the lab. But movies show you things that are happening in real life. But they are not really natural stimuli in the absolute sense of this conversation, right? So then we moved to storytelling, right? So, and then we took expert storytelling, like really know how to tell stories. And then we moved to people in the lab telling stories. They are not experts, it's their life. And now we move to open conversations that, as we do now, completely open-ended. So I think we need to define what our natural stimuli are, and I think it's changing over the time. And it's not only movies or storytelling. We do like teaching in the wild now. We really look on brains of teachers that they teach real life classes. So we go more and more natural. This is one point. The second point is where I say that it's a paradigm shift. I think there's a lot of assumptions about how the brain is working when you use control experiment. It's not, it will be, and we never discuss these underlying assumptions, but you assume how the neural code is working when you design a control experiment. You assume that there is like a confound and signal, and the brain is dealing with it by filtering out the noise and implement a very efficient code to solve the problem. And you design an experiment to expose this underlying computation. These are all assumptions. And I think what's happening now with natural stimuli is that these assumptions break down. And I think this is why I say there is a revolution coming. I think there is another way of, completely different way to implement a solution to the problem by using big data and mindless optimization. And this is the trick of machine learning that helping Google. But if this trick is used by the brain, then we're really going wrong by doing control experiment, because we assume a code that is not implemented in the brain. And if this will be correct, then my statement about revolution will really pan out. And if this statement is wrong, we will go back to control experiment. So it's still out there for us to test, but that's why I'm thinking it's only the beginning, because I start to suspect that is the case.
Let me move us along to another very general question, which is oftentimes we need to find this balance between advancing the theory in a field and advancing the tools. Which one do you think is currently ahead? Do you think we're a little bit further ahead on theory and the tools need to catch up? If so, like what kinds of tools do you think are necessary to really make naturalistic stimuli and even like resting state analysis more in line with sort of the standard event-related or block design experiments that are sort of the bread and butter experiments in Fmri today? You guys look pensive really well. Like,
maybe I'll chime in. I'm sure others have a lot more to say, but I guess kind of building off of what Emily mentioned earlier regarding some uncertainty, regarding some like very basic things like test retest reliability that we still don't know the best way to approach that, as far as I know. for naturalistic neuroimaging. So it seems like in some ways the tools are behind the theory with respect to figuring out the best way to ascertain things like some aspects of reliability and maybe internal validity regarding, like, when we make conclusions about like stimulus contents maybe, but like obviously external validity is much better than our typical approaches. But I think in some respects the tools are behind, even though there are such exciting methodological developments in analysis of these kinds of data sets that many of the people here spearheaded.
I think I might say that both the tools and the theory are behind the data right now, maybe especially as we're starting to collect these bigger data sets. Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions of what we should do with these pretty unstructured kinds of data sets when we're trying to connect individual differences. What are the right ways to do that, and what are the right things to measure? But then I think we're also still working on putting together the bigger theoretical pieces of like, what are the general principles by which we think that perception works in these cases, or learning or memory. And so I guess I'm hoping both the tools and the theory will start to catch up to these data sets that we have. And then, there's another direction also, which I think maybe Emily was mentioning, which is that we also need to think about tools for building the experiments themselves, right? And what are ways that we can structure these experiments in ways that are going to make them possible to analyze. And again, building up a whole new toolkit of how we can design these kinds of experiments.
Do you have a wish list for tools? I mean, there are people who code in the attendees list, so the right words might get you such a magical tool built if only they had direction.
Yeah, I guess some of it's less of a practical problem of building the tools as much as knowing, what are the right kinds of models for looking at things. And, as Uri mentioned, the traditional way is to really build a model that has tons and tons of assumptions in it, and maybe like one parameter that you're trying to fit to the data. And now with these kinds of designs, we can build things that are much more flexible, but of course that also increases the family of things that we could be looking at. And so, I think a lot of the tools that we have so far are sort of very flexible, which is great. But I think we do need to think about what are the kinds of specific hypotheses that we want to test, and how can we build those into models? How can we build in these kinds of flexible hypotheses about, and yeah, I mean, there's lots of categories of these things about what sort of dynamics look like within a brain region or across regions. Thinking about models that can incorporate information maybe from both resting state and task-driven designs. And so, I think as these data sets become more common, we're getting to try out a lot more of these kinds of tools. But I think, and again, this is maybe where the theory is lacking in some ways too, is I think we don't always know what to look for. What should we be fishing for in these data sets that would sort of prove or disprove a specific hypothesis about the brain?
I would tell you something that we're looking into, and it's helping me to develop the theory and the models at the same time. I'm not sure whether we are right, so I don't try to advocate anyone to do it. But it's really changing the way we are thinking. We really start to think about this like deep neural networks with millions of parameters that slowly optimize and fit to millions of examples as a cognitive model. We don't think about them as like an analysis tool. Most of the people that use deep neural networks, they use it like SVM. We have now a new analysis tool to capture things in the data and classify information. They don't think about it as a cognitive model. And once you go this step and say, actually, this is what implemented in the brain, and now I have a computational model that is optimized for natural stimuli, right? Because this is where they shine. This is why Google is like managed to drive in the real world and recognize faces in the real world and develop language model in the real world. If the brain using the same tricks, now you have a computational model, a cognitive model to test. So it gives you at the same time the analysis tool and the theoretical framework to analyze your stimuli. And this is changing the picture. And it's really help me think forward where we are heading, and this way it's also easy for us to move from movies that are highly controlled stimuli that cost $6 million to really open conversation that never repeat twice, right? And still model how the brain is working. So it's really a key that many of us can use.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of new stuff to add. I mean, I agree a lot with what has been said, that in a lot of ways with these very unconstrained stimuli, movies and resting state too, like often it feels like, what can we do with it? Like what tools, like how much, complex tools we throw at this and analyses approaches, and then that sort of shapes what we're learning from it. And rather than being more theory driven to then ask the question, because I think we are in this pretty new space of like, how do you deal with these very unconstrained data? So back to just the early question of why, kind of at the beginning, but I think hand in hand theory and tools, they're, need to be developed concurrently with, I would say, theory driving more, so we can, be guided by the questions we want to answer and less by what we are able to do.
Yeah, also for resting state, many times the problem is the validation of the tools, because you don't really have a gold standard of an answer. I think you guys in that sense have a little bit better situation. So maybe that's a way where we can validate some of the tools that we use in resting state by applying them to naturalistic and making sure that the answers we get can be interpretable, because many times, I mean, you give data in, you get something out, but is it really something that I should be interpreting? That's quite a problem for us sometimes. Now, I want to ask a little bit to Uri. Now, how do you go around, and you talk a little bit, but when you have a model that is 1.5 billion parameters, how, and I'm not saying that's the wrong way to go, but how do you try to make sense of it and learn something?
First, it's an excellent question and still ongoing. We're only at the beginning. There are a few things to say. First, we think that let's start with like few million parameters of faces or language model that are 1.5 billion or now 150 billion if you look on GPT-3, so it's getting bigger and bigger. Is it big model or small model? Relative to our like 5 interpretable parameters that we use to study, it's like insanely big. Relative to the brain, I don't know, I have like in the voxel I have more parameters. So relative to the brain, it's small models. The brain implementing these models on way bigger scale. So that's one point to remember. Secondly, how do you deal with it? There are many ways to deal with it, but if you look first, you need to understand how they are working. And once you understand the computational principles, they are pretty simple-minded models. They are not as sophisticated as people think, so you can see if the brain implements the same computational principles. And finally, if you look, for example, on the output of this model on the top layer, you get like a vector space of representation. Usually you have like between 128 neurons to 1,000, 2,000 neurons. So basically now you have 2,000 dimensions and not 150 billion parameters, right? So and this like dimensional space, vector space, can really implement it in the brain. So you can also use them to see whether the representation of the brain matches the representation of the model, and you move to embedding space, which is the new representation type. So what I'm saying, if you take it as a cognitive model, and you don't stop in this like onset, oh, we have like 1.5 billion weights. You look really how it's working, the model is a cognitive model, suddenly you have a key to understand how the brain is working, which we really don't use yet in cognitive psychology. We're really so obsessed with the control experiment that we see this like natural stimuli as a side gig of let's test our theories in natural life. This is how I started. Like I'm the guy that will test your theories. But what happened to me is that all the theories, crashed against natural stimuli and didn't pan out. So basically, I think we need to change our theories when we move to natural stimuli, and this is why it's only the beginning.
I'm going to continue on that with our first question, which was also from our first question asker on the first roundtable from Peter Banditini. He says, if I understand Uri correctly, it seems that an ultimate experiment would be for a machine learning system to simultaneously both generate stimuli and iterate towards more accurately predicting activation patterns, and then begin to generalize from these predictions based on our various ontologies for understanding the brain.
I'm not sure that I follow the question. Why do you need to generate stimuli? Why the network need to generate the stimuli?
I'll let Peter follow up.
Peter, why can't you speak?
I think I can actually unmute him.
That would be like lovely.
You hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's sort of, sorry, it was hard to type that question. It seems that kind of to sort of explore the parameter space of a brain activation, instead of sort of by hand, sort of thinking of, generating hypotheses and then trying to predict, you could use that with language or whatever. It seems that, having an efficient way of generating stimuli and predicting where there might be areas where there's gaps in terms of if the prediction is less accurate, you could sort of generate stimuli around that area to increase the accuracy, and then start to hone in on the relationship between the naturalistic stimuli and the activation patterns. Because, I mean, it's really complex, and it seems that you need to iterate that a lot. And that's what naturalistic stimuli is trying to do in some sense, it seems, to give a rich parameter space so that you can sort of pull out information. But it seems that it's still hard to do that, an experiment at a time.
I think basically there are two levels of answer that slightly complicate the answer to your question, which is like really good and deep. One is basically I'm going to say something really bad about current neural networks. They are simply very simple-minded networks that overfit to the training parameter space and then interpolate within, which is something we as scientists don't really take seriously. This is why many of the neural networks currently also have very easy to attack them with stimuli, and they're going to break out. You can send few pixels and you get like crazy answer from your network. So in a way, that basically even make more complicated what you are saying, right? Because the brain is more robust for this like subtle attacks, right? It's very difficult to attack the brain with the way we attack deep neural networks. So in a way, I don't think much about neural networks in the sense that they are not smart network. Okay, it's a very robust solution, but they don't understand the underlying structure. Saying that would complicate your question, because now how you change the stimuli to attack the network and to attack the brain, right? It complicated. We started to realize that this like simple-minded solution can also be used by the brain if you use it wisely, and it's a very robust solution. It's like evolution, right? You have a way to approximate any function in the world within the parameter space of the training set without understanding anything. And this is like evolution that finds a solution without understanding anything about the problem or the solution. And if it's also used by the brain, then you see it's even more complicated, because now these simple tricks can really use by the brain as well. And so I'm not sure whether I'm clear in my answer to. I guess I'm not, but but I have a good solution, a good answer for you. It's simply I will need a few steps to explain it. I have the bandwidth of it.
Yeah, I got the gist though. That's actually really a good point, that using machine learning on the experiment generation side is probably premature by a long shot right now. So
it's a mistake even, I will say, because and I think also this might be also the mistake of using control experiment to begin with. I think that the neural networks will overfit to whatever you give them. So if you give them the structures of a control experiment, they will take the shape of your data. But I think it's also true for the brain. So control experiment never give you the underlying computation. They give you the overfit and interpolation to your data structure. And this is why I think we need to change the way we think about the neural code in a way. And this is like the theoretical shift that I'm starting to realize, and I have problem to articulate it to people in the field because it's really requires some twist in thinking that it's difficult to do.
Okay, thanks. Yeah,
I wanted to say in response to Peter that yeah, this is something my oh, sorry, I lost you for 1 second. Sorry, yeah, I was responding to Peter that my lab's been really interested in, can we do things like try to pick the right kinds of stimuli that would be the optimal ones for distinguishing between different potential models. Actually, if you're interested in this, there's a session at CCN with some of our collaborators that, let's see, oh, attempting to paste in the chat.
There it is.
Yep. Sorry, I am plugged into the Ethernet. That doesn't always work. So yeah, we've been trying to do things like generate sentences that are where different models disagree the most on the extent to which what the meaning of these sentences should be, for example, right, as a way of trying to figure out which of them align the most with the brain. And so, yeah, so I think we can do this at the level of like individual sentences now, right? Not at the level of like narratives and movies and where I'd want to do it eventually. But I think we are starting to get in this direction where we could generate pretty naturalistic stimuli that allow us to do this kind of model comparison.
Okay, I'm going to pivot us a little bit, which is, I think, an important question. Being a developmental psychologist myself, going to take the question for Elizabeth Redclay on the message board, which is, can we be sure that the correlation between a child's time course and an adult's necessarily tells us information about maturity, especially since many brain regions are still in development? Is there a way that you could better measure this sort of similarity or difference independent of the MRI data? Is there additional metrics that you might use?
Yeah, so I saw that question too and was, I don't know if the person who asked is here to clarify, but I think part of that is also a little bit of the terminology, the neural maturity. So like we're using that as more of a way to understand development of the brain rather than sort of use it as a marker of like this child has achieved some kind of marker of maturity. So actually a reviewer on our paper suggested child to adult ISC, and I think I grumbled because that's more of a mouthful, but maybe that was actually the more appropriate way to describe it, because that in the end is really what we were trying to get at, just kind of like, but to really address the question of like, you know, a neural maturity, yeah, I think, you know, you would want to bring in some behavioral measures that could get at what it means to be at a mature standpoint that isn't just kind of referencing to some adult group that themselves are, I mean, college students, like still in ongoing phases of neural maturation. So yes, I think if I don't know if you want to clarify if there was kind of additional in that question that I might have missed. But...
let's see if he wants to.
Okay.
Since he is here.
I saw a chat pop up, but I don't know how to.
Yes.
Here it is. Okay.
He says, I asked the question and that answers it nicely.
Great.
Sorry.
Thank you for the question.
No, I definitely think it's an important thing to always keep in mind, which is that children are not just small adults, and as we tailor stimuli, there are open questions about how those go together. And you know, as someone who always ends up fixing everyone else's computers, I feel like adults are not necessarily giant children as technology is a moving pattern.
And of course, like thinking about, one response to a movie is not going to be a good index of that. So, thinking about developmental trajectories and how that may be a better index of where you are on that maturity curve is also a probably better approach.
Our next question comes from Hendrik, and he says, is it helpful or problematic that the publicly shared Fmri datasets are often heavily pre-processed?
Well, I mean, it's always nice. And the ones I work with, you usually have both the raw data and the pre-process. It definitely better come accompanied with all the details about how that pre-processing was done. That will help. And I think it also comes to what's the next step that you're going to do. There will be cases in which that pre-processing will apply, and there will be cases in which not. So having that extra information. Now, if you ask me, I think the best way is to have both something similar like the HCP, the raw data, and then something that potentially they've corrected all the spatial, they've done all the spatial normalization for you, and then you take it from there. Definitely any step that may preclude you from an analysis is better than the data is served before that step. Things like filtering or things that might actually preclude you from doing some other things after.
Yeah, we just uploaded like data actually found by the NIMH. So actually, it's like of all the stories collected in the lab over the like 6 years, I think. So we have like 4 hours of stories and 300 of subjects in total, and we always upload the raw data and the pre-processed one and notebooks to see exactly what we did. So I think usually you can find both. It's not exclusive. You don't have to go one or the other.
Yeah, I agree. I think fundamentally it's helpful as long as the raw data and the scripts are available and well documented. I mean, I think as we move to these larger data sets, it sort of becomes like an access. It's like we're sort of getting stratified into people that have access to the computational power, like just the pre-processing alone can require so much computational power that, if you have a good reason to go back and reprocess it, to be more appropriate for the question that you're asking, then, that's absolutely something that you should do if possible. But I think having the pre-processed versions available, it does facilitate people just sort of quickly grabbing data as a sort of replication set or to test, it sort of lowers the barrier to entry, especially for these larger scale data sets and even some of the smaller ones too. It's just sort of the ease that you can grab stuff and test stuff out. And I think the onus is still on the researcher doing the secondary data analysis to understand what the pre-processing was and what the choices that went into that were and how that might be impacting their results. But I think fundamentally it's a really good thing to have pre-processed versions also shared to just make access easier and analysis easier for people that are looking to use these data sets sort of quickly and easily in projects, maybe combining across data sets or testing the replicability of a result that they've seen on their own data. I think that's fundamentally a good thing.
Now, this also tells you that sharing data, it's a lot of work, which it's some work worth doing, but it's not think that sharing data is just creating a zip file and uploading it somewhere. There's a lot much more behind that.
I want to piggyback off of that because, as you both alluded to, or both said directly even, it is a lot of data. But I often have noticed that everyone's sort of inconsistency in sort of the supplementary data that goes with their data sets. So some people are collecting, say, physio, like heart rate and respiration. Some people are collecting eye tracking. Some people are collecting EEG and neuropsych measures and things like that. If, time was no enemy and you had all the resources that you want and not being able to say all of them as an answer, what would be on your wish list for things that you think would help drive your own questions forward in terms of additional measures? I already know Javier was going to say all of them. That's why I said you couldn't just say
yeah, no, I mean, everything. Definitely, I think having physiological recordings that accompany the data, it's very important. definitely you want to have the full list of parameters. I mean, sometimes people who don't do methods, they think that just a few parameters tell you everything about the data, but there are some other hidden parameters on how that data was acquired that might answer some questions later. For resting state, I'm a big fan of, or I would like to start collecting, concurrent EEG, concurrent peripheral hemodynamic signals, anything that may allow us to better model the noise. And then I think that moving forward for resting state is also important to start acquiring information about what's going on the mind of our subjects. And that can be done in many different ways. It can be done passively with, cameras and skin conductance, or it can be done a little bit more aggressively with questioning from time to time, and that's a whole open discussion. That to a minimum. For naturalistic, I imagine you want to have the actual stimuli. Potentially, if people have annotated in some ways, I do agree a lot with what Emily just said. It's really good to have the preprocessed data. For example, if like now, one thing I'm trying to look at is sleep data. I'm not an EEG expert, so if somebody already shares with me the sleep staging that they've done on the concurrent EEG, that might allow me to do a first pass. Then at the end, I would like to do it myself or make sure that data is correct. But that entry point, I think, to do some exploratory analysis, that's really important, the points you made there. Now, I know engineers, we tend to always ask the more the merrier, and then what do you do with it? That's another question. So.
Yeah, this is maybe an obvious answer, and there are people that have been doing this and continue to do this fairly elegantly, although there's still some technical barriers. Like I think eye tracking is sort of an obvious one with movies, and it's a question that comes up a lot, that we ask ourselves, that we get, or I get in review, like how much of, especially when you're looking at individual differences, how much of the differences in brain activity are due to differences in where people are looking at any given time. And to be clear, I don't see differences in gaze trajectory or gaze position as like a pure confound per se. I mean, there's obviously an interplay between where you're choosing to look, where you're directing your attention, and then obviously the image hitting your retina. So it's not a pure confounding signal, but it's definitely a signal that's probably mediating in some ways what we're seeing in the brain activity. And it's, depending on people's scanner setups and things like that. And there's, we just got a brand new eye tracker actually here at Dartmouth, which my lab has yet to play with, but that can be kind of annoying data to get because it just takes extra time to calibrate the thing. But my understanding is it's sort of getting more plug and play. And again, there are labs that have been doing this for a while and do see interesting differences there, either across individuals or across groups or some other manipulation that they're embedding into the experiment. So, obviously with eye tracking, it's not just gaze position, it's also, you can get pupil dilation, which can serve as an index of arousal in really interesting ways. So that's definitely one area that I'd personally like to beef up in my lab's work in the future, and definitely drawing inspiration from others that have been combining that modality elegantly with concurrent fMRI. Or just on its own. I think it probably has a lot to teach us, even just on its own.
And another thing that is actually, I agree with all of you. And another thing that really helps us more and more is to get better neural signals. So I think we need to, I wish we can have non-invasive tools that will go beyond fMRI and EEG and FNIRS. We need better resolution. We're working now a lot with ECOG, and it's really improving the signals that we can get from the brain, but it's still not enough, and we develop new technologies as well to get better neural signals and better assessment of the behavior as well.
Yeah, I would just add to that the behavior. I mean, you really want to know like who the eye tracking and who these participants are, like, more information, because I think that's sometimes with IC analyses in particular, because you're correlating a person to the reference. So you really want to know who is that group that is your norm. I mean, so that's really important. And I think especially a lot of moving into individual differences, like, how to model that has been complicated. But thank you, Emily, Ben, for doing a lot of that deep thinking about how you actually would kind of tease out those differences and not just kind of have to this generic norm. So just more information about who these participants are.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's like I feel like we're getting more, I mean, we still have a ways to go. We're definitely getting more sophisticated in the ways that we can think about and model within and between subject differences. But yet, we're often trying to ground them in some sort of external reference, which is usually some behavioral measurement. And there it feels like, I mean, I put myself, front and center in this, like we're just not very sophisticated in the behaviors that we're measuring. And some of that I think has been driven by, working with these large scale data collection efforts has been a blessing in many ways, but then in other ways, you're sort of limited to the measurements that were included in those, acquisitions, which tend to be, the sort of more traditional self-report questionnaires and things like that. And I think a lot of us are feeling a desire to move away from that, or at least supplement that with more ecologically valid, so to speak, measurements, like truly behavioral measurements as opposed to self-report and things like that. And I guess some of the mobile phenotyping or digital phenotyping stuff comes to mind. Some of the more computationally inspired task paradigms that can sort of pull out like latent cognitive strategy and things like that. Those are the things that kind of come to mind. And it feels like we need more data sets that are collecting both, sophisticated tasks on the neuroimaging side and also more sophisticated behavioral measurements. So yeah, really just echoing Elizabeth's point, but that's something I think about a lot is, we spend so much, or at least I spend a lot of time thinking about the neuroimaging side, and yet, we're relating it to these measures that haven't really been innovated on in a few decades now. So, what can we do on that side to beef up our sophistication?
I want to throw something crazy to the mind of people because I think it's starting quick reality, but I think this is really the future, especially for individual differences. Think that, currently language model, for example, they are trained on the entire internet. So they read all the books in the universe, right? Basically, to develop a language model. But let's say I know, Emily, I'm looking at, you give me access to all your emails ever written and all your lectures ever given and all your paper ever written. So now I can build a language model for Emily. It's big enough data might be to have a unique model of your language model in your brain, and that can be used to learn individual differences in completely new way of doing it by focusing on one individual and go deep. Big data within one individual, and this is really a new thing that's going to happen more and more, and it will give new tools to study individual differences.
Yeah.
Google have this model for us. For each one of us, Google built the model only for us to that they can do it. Yeah.
But just to clarify, if I give you all of my emails and all of my lectures, then I can move to Hawaii and a virtual part of me will be available to answer questions and teach.
Yeah, basically, it will generate fake documents that you've written.
Perfect.
In your voice.
Our next question is sort of general along these larger data sets from Oliver. Oliver says, I have a question regarding the reproducibility of individual differences research. How do the panelists view the claim by Markle et al. That brain behavior phenotype associations stabilize and become more reproducible with sample sizes of greater than 2,000? I think I'll sort of supplement that and say, like, where do you see the trade-offs of sort of these giant data sets of 2,000 plus people versus the more sort of, I was going to say bespoke, but sort of the smaller sample sizes for more nimble approaches?
I'll dive in here. I mean, I think this is, a really important point that's been coming to light. But I think one important thing to remember is that a lot of the papers that have pointed this out and, convincingly pointed this out have been on these large scale data sets where, for lack of a better term, it feels like a lot of the paradigms that go into these, both on the neuroimaging side and the behavioral side, are sort of these like lowest common denominator tasks and behaviors, right? And there was a nice paper from a couple of years ago. I think the first author's last name is Hedge. I don't think they were the first people to point this out, but they pointed out really nicely sort of the reliability paradox of, you know, the tasks and behaviors that give us the most robustness and reliability at the group level are the ones that are actually least reliable at the individual level, because there's just not a lot of individual variance, right? So a lot of the data that's going into those large scale data collection efforts that allow us to look at things like, you know, at what end do these correlations stabilize? It's data that sort of, it's not necessarily the data that is going to be the most sensitive to individual differences, because it's relying on these well-established paradigms that are well-established precisely because they give very robust effects at the group level, but don't necessarily give reliable individual differences or even reliable, you know, within subject changes. And so I think, you know, while those papers have convincingly pointed out the issue on those data sets, I think there can still be room to bring that number down in the sense of, you know, the number of subjects that's needed to see stable relationships if we can, you know, employ both task paradigms on the neuroimaging side and, you know, out of scanner behaviors that are more sensitive to the variance that we're actually trying to pick up on. So, and I think that's a big tension in the field right now is the need, or, you know, real or perceived, for these super large scale data sets to be able to nail down some of these questions, with balancing that with the need for innovation on the paradigms and the behaviors. You know, it's going to be hard to convince people to collect a 10,000 person data set on, you know, what's perceived to be a sort of unvalidated task paradigm, or, you know, and so, you know, I think there's room for both of these. You know, I think we need to still be able to try to innovate on paradigms and behavioral measures in smaller scale data sets, and hopefully, you know, have some sort of harmonization or synchronization, or, you know, with data sharing, be able to sort of combine across those and pick up on consistent, reliable threads. But yeah, that's just one thing that I think about a lot, is that a lot of this work has been done on these, you know, handful, one or two large scale data sets that have very specific measures on both sides of the equation, brain and behavior, that may not actually be the ideal ones for looking at stable individual variability.
I just want to add on to some of the points that you raised there too. I mean, a lot of my interest is really understanding social interaction, and it's like none of these large data sets that are, you know, can really speak to that at all. I mean, you're not interacting, it's all offline, it's all, you know, so you can't look at that sort of reciprocity between individuals. So, I mean, I agree. I think it requires a lot of innovation and task paradigms to be able to get at those kinds of questions, and also have better behavioral measures, like bringing those participants into the lab and having them engage with another peer, and those kinds of things you just can't do at the level of 2,000 participants. So yeah, we kind of need to be working on the small scale to innovate approaches and paradigms, and then bigger scale for the measures that we find more reliable.
I be really worried of it's like big data set that you simplify control experiment and do 2,000 subjects. It's really a waste of funding in a way. It's not the right way to go. If you go to big data, have a diverse sampling. I think my postdoc was saying it like really nicely. We are really good in controlling for the subject effect, but we never control for the stimuli effect. We're really good we want to sampling as many different people as possible, but we never want to sample as many stimuli as possible to see the entire space. So if you go to big data, sampling the entire space will be way more effective than highly controlled task for many subjects.
Excellent. One of the general questions that came up last time that I always like to make sure that I ask any roundtable is what sort, especially for like students who are interested in getting in the field, postdocs who are looking to either make a shift or get more involved in naturalistic stimuli, what sorts of skills and interests would you recommend to newcomers to the fields of naturalistic stimuli and or individual differences? The last roundtable we talked a lot about programming, but I imagine that there are also other skills that people would want. And if you want to talk about programming, like what programming would you recommend people learn?
Yes, you should answer.
Yeah, my usual stock answer is programming, just in part because many psychology programs at least don't really stress the importance of being able to learn programming, which is important both for getting the experiments themselves put together as well as doing all the analysis. I apologize. Me talking seems to make me drop. Yeah, there's a couple different kinds of programming you can think of. I mean, I think connected to programming is also things like math and statistics and probability that, as we start using these more complex models, the challenge with a lot of these more complex models is that they start using some of these techniques from machine learning. And, I think even people in machine learning don't always understand exactly what these models are doing, but we are starting to build a set of tools that things like, for example, learning like a little bit of linear algebra, learning a little bit of probability is really helpful for being able to just interpret the kinds of model fits that we're getting and understand how to run these things. I think connected to programming is also things like being able to deal with large data sets. So having skills for just things like working at the command line or, that as you're, maybe this is true in any kind of newer area, like niche area, that we end up building a lot of the tools ourselves and doing a lot of sort of custom work of just how to get data in and out of our pipelines and building systems for analyzing them. And so being able to get sort of into the internals of the system and doing these kinds of programming is super, super helpful. That's when people are joining my lab, that's one of the main things that we have them work on initially, is building up some of these skills.
I think on the other end is, sorry.
No, go ahead, Javier.
I was going to say understanding the data. You're going to work with one particular type of data. You have to understand the limitations of that data, what really means, how it, in the case of Fmri, really understand that, it's not a direct neuronal measure. And that really will set down how you interpret your results at the end. So having a little bit of that background, I don't mean to become an expert. I think it's another skill that is key if you're going to get into this game.
Yeah, I was just going to echo Chris in that I actually think, programming is obviously critical, but, at some level, you have to know what it is you want to program. And so I think actually starting with, if I could go back and do it all again, I would take a lot more applied math, basically, just like building intuitions for the quantitative concepts that a lot of the tools that we're working on, that we're working with are building on and using. That's the number one thing that I would tell students is to focus on that more than you think you need to if you're interested in psychology and neuroscience. And the programming is certainly helpful, but again, it's only as helpful as you know what it is you'd like to program. So that's my perspective.
I agree, that's all true, and maybe this is obvious, but let's not ditch psychology and cognitive science at the same time and totally go with all of our theories were wrong. We're just going to do everything data driven, and because I think there's still a lot to build on, and you need that theoretical grounding to even know where what you're learning, to even just conceptually interpret it. So maybe that was inherent in your question. You already have that. What else do you need? But I just want to still speak for the importance of that theoretical background.
I certainly didn't mean to say that being a psychologist myself, that you might hire someone and be like, oh, they already know how to program. This is great. I'll just, teach them neuroscience from the ground up or psychology from the ground up. there are obviously balances of skills. Taylor from the chat asks if there are any resources that you would recommend for brushing up on relevant math stats, and I'll go ahead and expand it for like neuroimaging analysis. And maybe I'll sort of direct part of this to Emily, since I know that she has worked very hard to create a naturalistic data website with colleagues at Dartmouth.
Well, yeah, that was actually several people on this call contributed to that. So there is, yeah, so we have this naturalistic data, I think it's naturalistic-data.org, that several of us put together last summer. It sort of builds on another Jupyter book website that my colleague Luke Chang made called dartbrains.org, which is the basis of our Fmri methods class here at Dartmouth. And we've made all of that, totally publicly available. It is pretty specific to Fmri data analysis. My favorite, maybe people are aware of these, but like just some of my favorite YouTube channels essentially for building mathematical intuition. So like 3 Blue, 1 Brown is amazing. StatQuest is really good. There's a whole series of signal processing videos by Mike Cohen. That's really great. I can try to just find some of these links and pop them in the chat. That might be easiest. But yeah, I think like there's so many things, from full classes through Coursera, that's several hours of lectures, to 3-minute videos that can just sort of give you the gist of a concept. There's some really awesome stuff out there.
Yeah, for programming, you can also add potentially the software carpentry website. That has some good, startup for Bash, Python, just the very basics.
Yeah, I'll just add, I guess, to add on to what Emily was saying. When I was a grad student, there wasn't as much in the psychology program content on the kinds of things that you guys articulated. And I found it really helpful to use some online courses like Stanford had, I don't know if it's still called Open edX, but there's one on statistical learning that I found really helpful and generative. And so I think a lot of things, it can be helpful to have more sustained engagement with concepts and training than you could get necessarily from like a short sort of dip of your toe in the pool from a YouTube video or website, even though those are also obviously quite helpful too.
I will say I got an email this morning, actually, that the sort of classic Introduction to Statistical Learning textbook with applications in R by sort of a series of well-known authors is hit its 2nd edition, and it is free to download from the author's website in PDF form. But you can also buy, a nice hardbound copy. Okay, I just got a question for Caroline, which is well-timed. Caroline, because a lot of your research is focused on sort of social connections, are people aware that they attend more to well-connected others? That's right. How well does their own understanding of how they interact socially map onto your findings?
Oh, that's a good question. So we personally don't have data that can directly speak to this right now, but there is some data from other groups showing that, as you might expect, people see themselves through somewhat rose-colored glasses most of the time. So people tend to think that they're better connected than they actually are. And also people tend to think that their friends are better connected than they actually are. And it might be a combination of biases, but also the fact that you have more chances to observe your friends having interactions than people farther removed from you in social ties. And also the fact that there's sort of a greater likelihood that you're going to be friends with people who are themselves well connected. So it's likely that your friends are better connected than on average, sort of maybe counterintuitively. So people do have this, for whatever reason, sense that the people around them are maybe more socially connected relative to the norm than they actually are. And there might be consequences of that, both for how worthy of tuning into they think those people are, and maybe how emblematic of norms they think those people are.
Very cool. Your neurons are the average of your 5 closest neuron friends. Question for Emily from email. Emily, you talked about sort of bespoke stimuli in your talk. How do you approach designing a bespoke stimulus? What advice do you have for researchers who want to try and design their own? What are some pitfalls to look out for that perhaps you've encountered?
Oof, it's a great question. I don't know if I'm the best person to answer it because we're sort of in our infant days of trying to do this. I believe Chris's lab has maybe done some of this too, so I'm curious as to what his response would be. But to the extent that we've done this at all, which again, we're sort of early days on this, we have been, I have a talented postdoc in the lab at the moment, Claire Grawl, who has been adapting some murder mysteries that were sort of designed for like parties, but they have sort of like sets of facts that we can manipulate in different ways and sort of present in different orders. She's also an animator and does voice stuff, so she, it's sort of like getting creative people in the lab, I would say, is a big plus with that. And then yeah, like I think people that aren't necessarily me have done interesting stuff. I mean, a lot of the barriers to entry for some of the animation work have been lowered recently too. So, if you have someone who's inclined to sort of learn those tools, you can actually, start to design your own animations with different storylines and manipulate different features using some of the amazing tools that are coming out of the more kind of like gaming or film industry. So those are some avenues that we've been thinking about, but it is definitely, depending on how deep you want to go, it's a labor of love. It can take a long time to do. I know actually Uri's lab has collaborated with artists, like writers and things like that. So yeah, I'm curious as to others' take on this question too.
Yeah, we have been using the Unity virtual reality platform. So to do teach people virtual reality locations, which we can then ask them to do different kinds of tasks with in the scanner. We've also been using this to make these kinds of like navigation style videos that we can use as stimuli in the scanner. And then, we've also been doing some of our own like creating stories and things, which in our case we're just writing ourselves because they're only a couple minutes long each, but creating stories that have particular kinds of structure that we want to test in the scanner. And so I think that's actually like a really fun part of using these kinds of stimuli, is being able to use some of them on your own, even when we've also often taken like full-length feature films and then adapted them in various ways, like cutting out particular pieces of them. So definitely me and others in my lab have gotten a lot better at things like voice and audio editing and things like that. There's also opportunities here for doing things. We have a project now that involves some game playing. So there's like an interactive game that people are playing that we created ourselves. We can also have people play it online and look at how they learn and how they remember the things that they're doing in the game. And so, again, that's another level of complexity of like the grad student in my lab is able to set up like a server that's running this game that people can play online. And so it's a lot of, definitely a lot of non-traditional tools, kind of skills for building these kinds of experiences.
At least subjects are enjoying the experiment, not like really get bored and falling asleep.
Two ideas that were risen at the last roundtable. One was as we find movies, or as people create movies or animations, it would be handy to have sort of a database of all the movies and how well they perhaps work in pulling out certain characteristics or traits. You could think of like a multi-dimensional Rotten Tomatoes scale for experimental stimuli. And the other one that came up was this question of like, how could video games be used to also be used in naturalistic stimuli? Because we do know that, at least from behavioral research and even standard EEG experiments, that video games show a higher level of engagement in the brain than sort of passive viewing. Anyone is welcome to carry that through the finish line.
Video games are great, like because they also have the action. It's not like only viewing; you also have the output. It's similar speaking, like the production aspect in language, and not only comprehension. So you want people talking, not only listening. And playing is another level of engagement and motor outputs that is really valuable to study. And I think it's more challenging, but we have some work going on, and I'm sure other people will also have work looking into it. So I think it's also the next step.
Yeah, the challenge is how do you, if you're doing something that's sort of by definition under the control of the subject, then how do you, like, design this in any meaningful way? So yeah, the direction we've gone a little bit is we're using the video game to basically teach people something that then we test in a more controlled session where we actually control what people get to do, right? And so the video game is purely for the purpose of like getting them to build a skill, right? And then we test that skill in a more controlled way. Yeah, ideally you'd be able to just have them in the uncontrolled environment the whole time. So we need to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, I think this is why we are moving now from control. I call it control, like not so stimuli, but basically that everyone go to the same experience. Right? Everyone see the same movie, everyone listening to the same, and then you can do reliability and compare across groups, individual differences across group or within subject. But we have like a fixed stimuli. It's easier to analyze. But now we're going to this like free conversation, for example. It's like similar to video games. This particular forum will never happen again. It's one-time event, right? How can you do analysis when you have like one-time event that nothing is repeated? And we develop methods to do it. And I think one of them is, again, if you use this deep neural network, there's models. Suddenly you can feed the model the conversation and you've got like a model. So they really have new ways basically to analyze it using this deep networks perspective that open the way to go completely natural. And I think this is going to be part. We're doing it now a lot in the lab, and we get a lot out of it actually. So free conversations, no experimental control whatsoever, and you can do real science in this fully natural. And I think that will also will go. That's what we do with the games as well. So that.
I think that you raise an important point, and it's one that I just think needs to be said in this session, which is that movies are not natural. I think we all know this, right? They're naturalistic, and we call it that for a reason, but they're, yeah, like as you're thinking about designing, moving away from movies that already exist and designing your own stimuli, and it depends on what you want to use the movies for. Like, do you want everyone to be engaged in a very similar way? But yeah, it's conversations, and I mean the kinds of things that are unpredictable and harder to control, and so I agree. I think moving more towards that less constrained, more unpredictable, more ability to have that sort of reciprocity built in will bring us closer to natural. But like, we're starting with movies, which are already way more complicated than anything we were dealing with before. I think sometimes we can get kind of caught up in like studying movies, but that's still not real life either, really.
It's part of real life because you see movies in the evening that when no one forces you. So it's part of real life, but it's highly controlled experiment at the same time. But
not just in the evening. I think Netflix's uptick in pandemic has shown that people watch movies all the time.
I'm going to put in a pretty shameless plug for a preprint that my postdoc and I recently uploaded, sort of the thesis is sort of basically exactly this. So, you know, we call movies naturalistic, but they are very carefully crafted and structured. We're not the first people to point this out. Uri has some wonderful neurocinematics work from back in the day, but we sort of put together, she has a background in media and communication studies, and so we put together sort of definitely incomplete, but hopefully still helpful list of things that people might want to think about or consider when it's mostly focused on these sort of found stimuli, these pre-existing movies, what to consider when choosing one of those. But to speak to the larger point that people have been bringing up, I think the video game style things and the sort of more choose your own adventure, for lack of, you know, the style of experiment where there isn't necessarily a shared identical time course across all subjects, that does force us to abstract away from the specific sensory input at any given time in order to analyze the data in a way that's commensurate across subjects, you know, that we can compare one subject to another, whether the goal is explicitly individual differences or not. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, I think ideally that's what we would be doing even with the more, it's funny that we're calling movies traditional now, but more like the more classic naturalistic stimuli. You know, I think ultimately the goal is, you know, should also be to generalize not only over subjects, but also over stimuli, as Uri alluded to earlier. And the way to do that is to, you know, be able to extract the higher level abstract features that aren't necessarily you know, purely the sensory input, but it's sort of what's going to allow us to compare across stimuli, both the more time-locked traditional movies and things like video games, where there's sort of a naturally evolving organic experience that could differ across people or across even the same person doing it twice.
Yeah, but not only the second order, basically I think Emily thinking about like a second order correlation. So you find a pattern, so then you see that it's like second order patterns you maintain across stimuli. This is one way to go, but another way, you can even do the first order correlation if you have the right computational model. For example, think about the language model. I can feed, if you have a conversational language model, I can feed this conversation and get the embedding. They can feed another conversation. So, and that allows us to do even first order comparison. So that's also happening.
Yeah, exactly. So I think having those models is, you know, exactly the way that we need to be going, and many people already are.
I think on the flip side of too many nuances leads me into a question for Javier, which is what roadblocks exist to deep data annotation? How can we make sure that researchers can synthesize such large amounts of data without being overwhelmed or falling into disorganization? Oh yeah, you're on mute.
I said that's a good one. Well, I mean, I don't have an answer. I think that coming back to something we said before, maybe this is when we need to join forces. You know, if we're gonna put our money somewhere, maybe the way to put it is to really create a few, like Uri alluded, deeply annotated data sets in which you have a team that allows you to do this properly. Because of course, one very stupid thing is synchronization of all this data. And that sounds really silly, but sometimes we miss that point. So all these different recordings that we may have, they need to be synchronized. Otherwise, that's not useless, but difficult to analyze, to say the least. I think you could start small with the more obvious ones, like eye tracking, EEG, and potentially I'm toying with the idea of having cameras inside the scanner so you can record something more than just, you know, their head motion, but any other kind of action that they may have. And then you build from there. I think constructing some kind of standards for those things, whether, you know, I'm thinking of bits, but bits extending to all these annotations, so we all annotate it in the same way. So the first step is not just to understand how you decided to give me the information, but just to go for the information. And then to really fund it, because as I tried to say earlier, I mean, sharing data, it's a job by itself. So we might have to have people that's their job. And I don't think I fully answered the question, but those are the main things I can think of as starter points to then take it from there.
that's excellent. And that leads me in perfectly to my last question for all of you, which is in the last workshop and actually attending the last roundtable and this one, we do have folks from the extramural program who are interested in what types of requests for proposals you would be interested in seeing. Like what do you see as maybe the next step, whether it's small or large, in your research that you're excited about but haven't seen a grant mechanism for yet? Lots of smiles there.
All right. Okay. I have one, but I will let other people first. I can
Well, we're in like Final Jeopardy, so there are
okay. So if no one, okay, I will go first if no one's like jumping for me. I think basically, I think it's people mentioned before this like big data set of like many subjects using many control experiments. Like actually few control experiments, the ABCD is like a nice example of it, right? It's like a very highly controlled set of tasks that you know well, and then you scale it across the development scale, which is like very nice to have. I'm happy that they're doing it, but I think we need to do the opposite. I think we need to go big data and natural and sampling very different natural stimuli. It's going really against the way it's currently working. And big data is tough, but we know that the breakthrough in machine learning happened in these like big companies because they have the big data, like Facebook had the big data, Google, and this is what bring the revolution of machine learning the world. It's very difficult to have big data in neuroscience because we have like 1 hour movie over like 100 subjects. That's like a big data, but like 1 hour movie, it's like nothing. We didn't sampling the entire parameter space. And if you really want to sample everything, that's like a big undertaking. And I think this is the challenge, and also not as interesting labor because it's a bit, collecting big data is hard work. As Javier mentioning, there's a lot of alignment and be pedantic and that you're doing. That's what we need. We need funding to generate big data set, and I'm talking like really big and diverse data set of natural stimuli. We have to do it.
Else?
Agreed. I also just want to say that I think a lot of the work and a lot of the development of analysis tools and questions has been focused largely on adults, and there's all of these, like a lot of the complexities get kind of magnified when you try to think about how to understand atypical development or developmental change. And I would like all of your brains working on that question too. I know Chris is, and there's many, maybe others are as well, but just really like turning attention towards how do we apply a lot of these insights and a lot of these tools and all these questions towards understanding, the question of developmental change and processing these kinds of naturalistic stimuli. So that would be my plug for development.
Yes, I agree. Absolutely. And actually, we're doing something like that. I'll tell you later. Big data. We need funding for big data.
Fair enough.
Just...
Chris, you looked like you were about to say something, and or your pencil face is just really good.
Yeah, I definitely agree with both of those. I think building, especially for some of the questions my lab wants to answer about things like how do we represent different kinds of semantic categories, or how do we represent sort of sequences of thoughts as we're thinking about dynamic events. The only way that we can really do that is if we have a very large set of not just people, but as Ari was saying, different kinds of stimuli, right, that we're showing to them. And so, yeah, we're still, I think we still don't have that right kind of data. And again, I think we also need to think about building up the tools side of how do we scale our approaches up to these kinds of spaces. And it's, you know, it's just very far beyond the traditional kind of like pick two categories approach, where we're talking here about maybe millions of concepts. And so, yeah, and maybe going off of what Elizabeth was saying too, I think getting different kinds of populations in the scanner. So developmental is a super important one, but also things like clinical populations, or looking at differences of people that, you know, especially for narratives, we might expect big differences across different cultures or across people with different experiences. So my lab started doing this a little bit. This has all been through collaborations with people that are collecting really interesting data sets on particular subpopulations. But I think that's important too, to remember that we're not just sampling from sort of just the average person in the world, or maybe to realize that such a person doesn't exist, and that we're actually interested in these differences across people too.
And also, I mean, when we get these big data sets, it's also important to think that we're trying to get all this information from 2 hours of meeting with this person. This person is much more, so we need to integrate it with a lot of information about what's going on in the life of these people now. That opens a lot of ethical questions about what information you require or not. But I think to have that thought that it's not all about what happened during those 20 minutes of a scan or an hour, but put that in the context of the medical history and many other factors, it's important when we acquire the data.
Absolutely, and that was also the problem with developmental studies. Traditionally, they try to have a very sparse sampling of the phenomena. You know, you come for 5 minutes to an hour to the lab with your baby in different ages, and you do like experiment, but you really doesn't capture the statistics, doesn't capture the change over time and learning. I think basically learning is part of neuroscience, and because we have such short experiments, we never look into learning over time in bigger context. So longer time scales than the hour of experiment or an hour of a movie. There's like long range dependencies and time scales and synaptic change, and we don't even have the tool to look on synaptic change and learning over time that we really need to develop in neuroscience.
Excellent. Well, I hate to cut it off, but we are at time. So want to thank all of our panelists today for taking time out of their busy schedules to answer questions and generate great discussion. There are unanswered questions on the message board if you're ever curious what other things people may have asked over time. But thank you all for being part of this workshop. And to anyone who hasn't had a chance to go view all of the 9 hours and 42 minutes of the workshop, I absolutely highly recommend it. I've watched it twice, well, listened to it once and watched it once, but lots of great information there. So thank you all for being part of this.
Thanks for organizing.
Thank you so much for organizing.
Thank you for organizing. Yeah.
Thanks. This was fun.
Thank you.
All right. See you guys soon.
Bye, guys.